All right. So the movie Rustin was produced by Barack and Michelle Obama, and the idea that he put forward is that he wanted this guy, Bayard Rustin, to be known, a guy who wasn't very much, both during his lifetime and later. So, question I kind of want to throw out there, and Barack Obama addressed it a little bit, is why is it that a figure like Rustin um, seems to be left out of the histories that we tend to tell about?
I think he kind of stated in there that he was a little ahead of his time, and that yeah, he was just way ahead of his time, and he was obviously like just denied a lot of things because he said he was openly gay and he was a part of the bus movement and stuff like that. So
Yeah, so he was way ahead of his time in many ways, and his sexuality has been one of the key things that historians, John D'Amelio is the main historian on this particular aspect of Rustin's life, but that his sexuality is kind of what, you know, made his history kind of fade away, even as a lot of his ideas were finding traction through the voices of folks like Martin Luther King. But there's two other reasons that I wanted to mention. We recognize that we're at the end of Black History Month this year. This year, if I'm right, there's an extra day because I think it's a leap year. But we're at the end of Black History Month, and I want to suggest that part of the reason we don't know Bayard Rustin's history is simply because we don't know Black history. Every year Black history comes around and we trot out the peanut guy. And no disrespect to George Washington Carver, because he wasn't just the peanut guy, right? He was quite a scientist who had quite a remarkable career, but that's how we trot him out, right? He's the peanut guy. And then we might throw in Rosa Parks, and we throw in, of course, Dr. King, but we rarely actually talk about their ideas. If anybody thinks about Martin Luther King, we usually go to one particular speech, right? We all know some part of the I Have a Dream speech. Well, that speech wouldn't have happened had it not been for Rustin. And then the third reason is because Rustin had some what we would call leftist, well, not some, he's pretty purely leftist in his economic ideas. And the near the end of his life is when Reaganomics and that kind of thing started taking off. And so a lot of his economic ideas that were really central to his platform and also to Martin Luther King's platform were kind of pushed aside for more libertarian economics. And so those are three of the reasons that he often gets left out. But I also wanted to, I handed those out, I guess. Oh, here's one. If anybody else would like, I've got some discussion questions here that Dr. Dow can pass out. But I wanted to ask, the first question on here is kind of what I hope a lot of our talk can be about, is how much thought had you given to how your friendships might not only influence you, but help build a more just society? So before we get to answering that question, I want to tell you just a little bit about two of Rustin's friendships. One is the one we've already mentioned, his most famous friend, Martin Luther King Jr. I just want to list a few of his other friends. He was also friends with Ella Baker, big civil rights movement person, Mahalia Jackson, A. Philip Randolph. He was a friend and a mentor to Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the first prime minister of India after it was after they broke away from British colonialism. He was actually planning to go meet with Gandhi because he was speaking at an international peace event that Gandhi was also supposed to be speaking at, but Gandhi got killed. And then he also aided about 6 different countries in Africa that were working towards breaking away from colonialism as well. So a whole list of friends, and we could keep going on and on about the folks he influenced. But first with King. So one thing, if you've seen the movie, and if you haven't, this is something you can be looking out for, is that King kind of, whenever Rustin's sexuality comes up, King kind of pushes Rustin to the side. So one thing that you might not know, Martin Luther King Jr.'s first ever publication, the first publication that has his name on it, was written entirely by Bayard Rustin. I think that's interesting because we think of King as this man with a lot of words, published a number of books, lots of speeches, but his very first magazine article that had his name was written by Bayard Rustin. And that was for a couple reasons. One of them, Rustin's sexuality came up. And so Rustin realized that for the sake of the movement, him being too much of a public figure would give rise to all kinds of attacks, which maybe we'll get to in a minute. But so he forms this friendship with King because he sees King as this sort of rising star. But what he recognizes, and he says, he's got some great quotes about Martin Luther King. He said that King couldn't organize vampires to a bloodbath. He said he just needed people with hard heads and hard asses. But basically, the point he was making was that King was not an organizer. He was an inspirer. He was a great thinker. He was a great leader, but didn't have great organization skills. And when you're trying to organize something like the March on Washington, well, that takes that capacity. And so Rustin kind of stepped kind of behind King and lifted him up. So I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that before Rustin got involved, the Montgomery bus boycotts were starting to fail. They were looking like they were going to peter out in the very near future, and Rustin got on the phone with friends, mostly in the north, and said, hey, does anybody have cars you can donate? And so they were able to bring a bunch of cars down. And so now folks who were boycotting the buses, they set up basically like a taxi service, and Rustin organized this whole thing, which made it to where that boycott could go on until they had reached their goals in integrating the bus system. And so he kind of puts King into the national spotlight, and King relies on him for years. Rustin writes many speeches or co-writes many speeches for him. And then it comes out that Rustin had been arrested for, I believe the charge at the time was public indecency or lewdness. So he was a gay man. They caught him in some kind of sexual act with another gay man who was arrested in Pasadena, California. And so when this all came out and Rustin got put in jail for that, King and a number of others kind of abandoned him. And in fact, when Rustin had the idea to start the March on Washington, he and A. Philip Randolph had this dream to do this for years. They approached King, and King told them he had no interest. He thought that Rustin was tainted. And although he had relied on Rustin to get to the point that he was, he for a long time pushed back and said, no, I don't want to be a part of that. And eventually A. Philip Randolph, who is kind of a previous generation of civil rights leaders, was respected by all the main civil rights organizations, comes and says, listen, we can't do the stuff that we're trying to do without Rustin. And so they decided they're going to put on this march. And then when that's announced, Strom Thurmond, the senator from, where's he from? South Carolina? I don't know. Mississippi. He in my mind, he's not a figure worth knowing too much about. He was a terrible human being. And so he, on the floor of Congress, gave this speech, this kind of tirade about how they're letting this sexual pervert communist, et cetera, lead this movement. And so he was trying to discredit it, and didn't even have his facts straight. Rustin spent about a year and a half, maybe two, in his kind of college years exploring communism, because it was the only group he saw in New York City that was trying to do any kind of work towards racial reconciliation and justice. But he quickly realized that was not the place for them, and he was actually a very outspoken anti-communist for the rest of his life. He was a democratic socialist, as were most everybody in his orbit. Final thing that I'll say about Rustin's friendship with King is that, anybody know the full name of the March on Washington? All right. Well, it's the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. We often think about this march as primarily being about African American folks gaining certain civil rights they didn't have. And certainly that was an element. But a big concern for Rustin and for King, we missed this part of King's legacy, but the entire final chapter of his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, he over and over again talks about the abolition of poverty, So he talks about how we can reduce poverty, and they ultimately write up a document together called the Freedom Budget for All Americans. And they have a guy named Leon Kieserling, who had done some New Deal legislation and all this. He was an economist he was well regarded, and they put this budget together, and their very ambitious goal was to end poverty in the United States within a decade. And what was even crazier is that Rustin, as a lifelong pacifist, made sure to say, we're going to do this without cutting defense spending, because he knew that if they went after defense spending, that they would get a whole bunch of roadblocks. And so they wrote out a whole plan. A few years back, some professors and I at SMU wrote kind of a new version of this, a more condensed version, and we sent it off to John Lewis, who was one of Rustin's mentees. Rustin mentored him and Sophie Carmichael and a number who later changed his name to Kwame Ture. So anyway, they focused largely on this economic piece, because Rustin's kind of idea was, okay, so it's great if we win the legal right to eat in a restaurant, but if I can't afford to eat there, I'm no more free to eat there than I was the day before. Or now I have the legal right to stay in this hotel, but it's out of my budget because I don't have a good job. And so his idea was building this coalition. And so they started with civil rights leaders, but the final group that was the Big Ten ended up including a few labor leaders as well, because they were really focused on this jobs aspect. All right, so that's one friendship I want to end what I have to say about that for now. And then the other one I'll say less about because it was much shorter lived. And he had an interesting friendship with Malcolm X. So Rustin was an outspoken, completely committed to nonviolence kind of guy. He absolutely despised the idea of separatism. He had a lot of disagreements. Let's just put it that way. A lot of disagreements with Malcolm X. But Malcolm X was such a lightning rod figure that he was having trouble getting speaking gigs. And so even at HBCU, so for example, Howard University, Malcolm X was trying to speak there and they would not have him. And so Rustin calls up Howard University and he says, how about this? How about you invite Malcolm, but if you need to look like you've got some balance, bring me too, and we'll just have a debate on stage. And then he calls up Malcolm, and I love this. I wish I had the exact quotes with me. I have them in my dissertation somewhere, but he calls up Malcolm and he says, look, we've got a gig at Howard. We're going to do this thing. And Malcolm's like, great, what are the details? And he said, well, you're going to get up there and tell them all your stupid ideas, and I'm going to get up there and tell them why you're wrong. And that was the conversation. And they get up, and you can find at least one of these debates. I know you can find, or used to be able to find, on YouTube. So might be something interesting for y'all to look up. So they have this friendship where they both realize that one another's offering something valuable to this discussion, not only about race, but about jobs. And their sort of point of contention from Rustin's perspective, Rustin basically said, hey, Malcolm, you've got a lot of really great rhetoric, but what's your plan? That was the question he keeps coming back to in the debate, right? What's your plan? Rustin's like, I can show you my plan. In 3 years, we do this. In 5 years, we do this. Here's how we get from point A to point B to point C. And this isn't, of course, to say Malcolm X didn't have a plan. It's just to say that Rustin kept kind of trying to pull this out of him, and Malcolm doesn't offer really any specific or concrete details, although we certainly get those with groups like the Black Panthers, who have, started what became the free school lunch program, among many other things. So two very different friendships, one that he had over many years that kind of waxed and waned, not because of Rustin. Rustin was faithful to it, but because of King and King's concerns. Some of you might know that J. Edgar Hoover said that he was going to expose them and say that they were lovers and all of this kind of stuff. And Martin Luther King was already kind of in trouble with these rumors and things about him being with prostitutes and all this. And so he kind of cuts Rustin off. And then Malcolm X, he and King never had any kind of debate. And so it's interesting to see Bayard have this debate with him, because we get to see kind of these two perspectives, and King's perspective is so shaped by Rustin's that often you'll hear King in some of his later speeches, like his protest of Vietnam, using stuff that's verbatim Rustin's words from protesting World War II. So anyway, that's just two of their friendships. And so that's something that's on my mind, and I wanted your thoughts on. Have you ever considered how your friendships shape who you are, but how they might contribute to a more just society, or perhaps a less just society?
To be fair, I haven't thought too much about like societal effect, but I have thought about some of my friends, because I noticed that when I got to college, I started studying more, because I had friends who studied a lot. And it was really something I didn't do much in high school. And I feel like it's because I'm surrounded by people who do that. And, kind of just going to think like going to parties or not going to parties, I feel like I'm kind of influenced by like where my friends go, or like if they go or not. And so that's the thing I've kind of thought about, like how my friends' actions influence mine. Because I feel like, especially when you're hanging out with someone for such a long time, such a close proximity, that you guys kind of assimilate beliefs a little bit. So,
Yep.
I don't know. I have thought about just like how my friends make me. I've tried to like befriend people I feel like will make me a better person. I try to stay away from people who I feel like derail me.
Yeah, I love that. And that's exactly Rustin's approach. So Rustin was raised a Quaker, and he was raised by his grandparents, and his mother functioned in his life as his sister until later he found out the details of all of that. But he was raised Quaker, and especially by his grandmother. And so she taught him early on about the importance of friendships, and about looking out for friends who would do what you're saying, that help you become more virtuous, right, in some way. And there's a story from Rustin's childhood where he and one of his friends get in an argument, and the friend uses a racist slur. And so Rustin comes in and he's mad, and his grandmother offers him dinner, and he's not, I'm not going to eat, I'm too mad. And he's like, well, do you think your friend's over there eating his dinner? And he's like, well, yeah, probably. And he's like, so why are you going to come over here and punish yourself for your friend who's clearly not invested in this? And so Rustin learned very quickly kind of who he could trust to be a friend and who he couldn't. And we can't get into all of this, but his earliest friendships were primarily, of course, with some African Americans, but primarily with Jewish folks. And one of his earliest stories, in fact, the first time he saw an example of passive resistance, one of his Jewish friends, who was considered white in as much as they were allowed to, I believe it was the local YMCA, to go in and to use their facilities. And Rustin wasn't allowed in. And so his friend, they were, I don't remember their ages, but they were, they were kids. His friend said, I'm going to sit here in the office of the YMCA manager until he either explains to me why my friend can't come in or until he lets him in. So they sat there for, I forget how many hours, but sat there for hours as kids. And so that was his first sort of experience with seeing this, even though it's something he had learned about from his mom. And so took very seriously later in his life who his friendships were. Something that I want to say about that I think is important is that Rustin really believed in coalition building, but he didn't do that as sort of the primary work. For him, the primary work was building a friendship. So he built genuine friendships with labor leaders and with civil rights leaders. And then out of those friendships is kind of like, okay, what can we do to make the world a more just and more generous and more charitable place? And so then he would bring in those friends and say, let's get together. And that's kind of what he did. He gets this group of 10 friends together in a room. And I love this. So being a Quaker, if you're not familiar with Quakers and their practices, the way that they typically will have what you might consider a church or worship service, they'll go and they'll sit in silence until somebody has a word to speak, from God or whatnot. And then another thing about Quakers that's important is that they do things by consensus. And so from the beginning, when Rustin started leading the March on Washington, he had all of these massive egos in the room, right? You've got the leader of the NAACP, Roy Wilkins. You've got the leader of CORE and SNCC, both of which are groups that Bud Rustin helped start. You've got labor leaders. You got Martin Luther King. You got a lot of well-known people with big egos in the room. And so Rustin said, we're not voting on anything. We're going to do everything by consensus, and we don't leave the room until everyone can get on board with whatever plan we have for moving forward, which helps keep some of those big egos in check. I want to ask this next question because I want to maybe lead us somewhere else with it, but I want to see what y'all have to say first. You ever considered, I'm sure you've considered, but what does your consideration perhaps look like of the behind the scenes folks in the civil rights movement?
So I actually took my TC class was it dipped into a lot of people of color, and it was a lot of the times it was brought up about the people behind the scenes, not only in we talked about a play, but in clay making in that time too. And we talked about the importance of them because nothing would have really happened or went on without the people who did the small details or who ran things and weren't big into the media or into the crowd or an important face.
Yep.
So we dipped really into how important that was.
Did y'all talk about any particular figures in those discussions?
No. So my TC class was the Hamilton one.
Okay.
So we talked obviously about like how the behind the scenes people were mostly people of color and they weren't paid correctly and things like that, and how um all of the like rules and everything that changed for that was important because they kept everything running. So we
Yeah.
didn't talk about like exact people, but more of just like a general understanding of what happened then.
Yeah, and it's massively important, these folks behind the scenes. Anybody else want to voice any thoughts on that, Daria?
Yeah, I know. It is lucky.
You want to come back to it in a sec? All right, well, you've got one, sir?
Just like in terms of examples, I know a lot of people who did the sit-in protests and diners have to go through like training and things like that, and a lot of people don't talk about that. Like,
Yeah.
they have to prepare themselves for the fact that they're going to get beat and spit on and things like that. And also, like a lot of the organization for protests within cities happen in like local black businesses like barbershops and things like that. And I feel like it's like it's a thing that kind of goes unrecognized because we see like the big speakers and the big speeches, and not like the organization took to get people to go there, and just like the connections people have to make in order to get people on that sort of platform.
Yeah, absolutely. It was the March on Washington is one example. Imagine trying to organize getting they were shooting at the time for 100,000. They ended up getting closer to 250,000. But imagine trying to get 100,000 people to Washington D.C. and they had a little less than I think 3 months from the time they decided announced it to the time when it happened, and so they had to do this in the age before the internet. So think about how many people in the movie Rustin shows some of this, where you've got people on phones, and one of the most important figures in that particular aspect, who's only barely mentioned in the movie, is a lady named Rochelle Horowitz, who was in charge of getting everyone there. So her job was to arrange all of the buses and the planes and all of that. And, you know, they had to do things to count out how many sandwiches they were going to have prepared, how many medical tents, how many porta potties. And Rustin had this whole deal that the movie hints at. He had a whole thing where they trained police officers, off-duty police officers from other cities, to intervene non-violently if there was an issue. And they set rules like, if you were a black cop, you could only arrest a black person. If you were a white cop, you could only arrest a white person. And all these details that were set up in this march. And they actually had it where the police, the DC police, who originally wanted to bring in the National Guard and all this, were pushed out several blocks. And they ended up not having any incidents that day with 250,000 people there. But what I wanted to note in this is that even when we're looking at the behind the scenes folks, a lot of behind the scenes folks have folks behind the scenes that get left out. So, for example, Rustin in the movie, it's one of the few scenes I've seen in any movie that even hints at this, and that's really about all it does, is that Rustin kept women out of all of the speaker positions. The day of the March on Washington, there were 10 speakers. Ella Baker could give a hell of a fiery good speech, and she wasn't given a microphone. Mahalia Jackson, she was an entertainer, but also a civil rights leader, and some of y'all may or may not know that King's prepared remarks that day went off track because she shouts out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." And he goes into this more friendship direction, actually talks about holding hands and all this. But Rustin left out women who had proven every bit that they have all of the skill and the bona fides to do any of this work. And they did a significant amount of that work. and yet didn't get to have their voices heard on this platform.
Especially, I mean, the Montgomery bus boycott, you say it wouldn't have happened without fire, it wouldn't have happened without women.
Yes.
It was their idea.
Yeah, exactly.
So they were kind of doing that work. And in SNCC, women were fundamentally young, college age women were such an important part and completely left out in this kind of history.
Yes, absolutely. And this is, Rustin is one of my heroes. He's somebody that I have a ton of respect for. And I just want to say, dude, you messed up here. You got this one wrong. And the movie even shows a scene where Ella Baker confronts him about it. He's like, why are you not, giving the microphone to one of us who's put in as much or more work than anyone, any of you guys has. And so I think that's really important that we think about, even when we're considering the behind the scenes and the people who are kind of forgotten to history, that even they have people who are forgotten to history, right? So Rochelle Horowitz, who I mentioned, I'm sure she had a whole team of people that she was over that were making phone calls to arrange buses and all of these things. So we'll never know a lot of those folks' names. So yes, I wanted to just make sure that we address that, and it's something that could be and should be addressed a lot more. There were other folks kind of adjacent to the movement. Polly Murray's a favorite of mine, who was also queer and didn't get a lot of the respect. You've got Ida B. Wells, who, journalists covering all of this stuff, putting her life on the line. So not to belabor that point, but Rustin screwed it up on that one. So going back to him and thinking about the March on Washington, instead of doing that, I just want to let's open it up to y'all. Do you have any questions about Rustin, his legacy, his ideas that you're interested in, either based on what you've heard now or see a hand back there?
Yeah, does he have like a coming out story, or was he just kind of was it assumed he was gay? Like, how do people really know his sexuality?
Yeah. So he had kind of a few coming out stories, if you will. So he came out to his grandmother relatively young. I want to say maybe like late teen years, which would have been in the 1930s. Yeah, that's about right. I'm not a historian, I'm not great with dates. Somewhere around the 1930s, he came out to his grandmother, and she was kind of like, okay, well, I kind of had my suspicions, that was kind of, and she kind of almost treated it just nonchalantly, like, whatever, no big deal. You're still my kid or my grandkid. And then later, Rustin ends up in New York City, and there's at the time apparently a pretty big gay scene, and so he is going to gay bars and these kinds of things, and while he's doing that, he's inviting some of his friends. At that time, he wasn't in what was really the civil rights movement. He was more focused on the peace movement, so anti-nuclear weapons, different other peace things. He would take those friends with him to some of these bars. Certainly, all of his closest friends knew. A.J. Musty, who was kind of the main guy in the peace movement at the time, he knew, and they have a very complicated friendship, because Musty was okay with Rustin as long as he was okay with Rustin's sexuality as long as Rustin was getting his job done in the organizing world, and as long as he was keeping it quiet. And so when Rustin got arrested in Pasadena, it kind of fractured he and A.J. Musty's relationship, and Musty actually paid for Rustin to go to counseling So that would have been, now we're looking at, so 53, so in the 50s to go to counseling for being gay. He didn't go to very many sessions, figured out, hey, this isn't gonna work. You can't counsel somebody into being straight. And so, yeah, so people pretty much knew from early on. He didn't get involved in LGBTQ rights work until really the end of his life, when he met his life partner, Walter Nagel, who's still alive. In fact, I talked to Walter just the other day. And Walter, I think, kind of helped bring Rustin out to feel more comfortable. Say, not only can you say I'm an out gay man, but you have the skills and capacity to do for the gay community, the LGBT community, what you've helped do for the working class community and for the Black community, right? And so for a very short period of time near the end of his life, he did work in that world, but he died in 87. So, didn't get very deep into that work before the end of his life. And that was a concern, actually. And this is a discussion that maybe is worth having. It's one we had in my class yesterday. But if Rustin's having been gay got in the way of things like the March on Washington and civil rights, where is it worth the trade-off? Was it right for them to kind of say, hey, Rustin, you need to kind of step to the side and be quiet? Or should they have kind of put him more front and center on these kinds of things?
Really, because he felt he didn't have the right to speak, he then just that's why he thought they would also get in the way, but with the same thinking that
no, that's quite a real possibility, because actually later in life, Rustin, who I said was a lifelong pacifist. So one way people put it is that he kind of turned to the right and became more conservative on some things. I debate that a little bit. One thing that he does shift to, just as an example, is he comes out to Martin Luther King and says, hey, you need to quit protesting the Vietnam War. We're losing gains, or we're gonna lose gains that the civil rights movement is making, and you speaking up about Vietnam is gonna, cause us to lose some of this. And this is coming from a man who, again, King was basically quoting when he's protesting the Vietnam War. You could see whole sections of Rustin's words just right there. Rustin's telling him, hey, don't do that, because this is going to interfere with the gains that we've made. That's an important question I think is really worth considering, is what we're willing to sacrifice or let other people kind of do when it comes to there being multiple intertwined injustices. How much might you have to put aside, concern for one in order to deal with another, or maybe recognizing that they've got to be sort of fixed chronologically, is perhaps a suggestion. So Rustin's kind of saying, first, let's get some of this civil rights stuff going to where now Black folks, have the right to stay where they want in hotels, stay where they want on buses, eat at the restaurants, all these kinds of gains and a number of others. Okay, so now we can move on to the next thing, which is our focus on ending poverty. And then we can end poverty, and this was a big belief of Rustin's that kind of undergirded most of his thinking and his work, is basically whatever poor people's reality, otherwise poor people very rarely have a voice or power in society. And so Rustin's kind of idea was, hey, if we can get some poor folks to not be poor anymore, but they happen to also be Black or gay or some other thing, well, now they have more opportunity to speak up and have their voice heard. because now they're in respectable middle class society. Now they have maybe the ability to take time off work to go to something like the March in Washington or be a part of a protest. Or for a lot of folks, we know this is a problem even today. Voting hours often happen during when certain people cannot get off from their day of work without losing their wage. And so Rustin was very concerned that folks have financial stability, because he believed that with financial stability came the power to then address all of these other social ills, from racism to homophobia to you name it. And his basic proposal for doing that was in the freedom budget. He proposed a universal basic income, suggesting that all people ought to get paid a livable wage, whether they work or do not. An idea that was quite popular at the time, and an idea that we hear very little about these days, at least compared to a lot of other economic ideas. I felt like you were about to ask something.
Yeah, I'm always about to ask.
That's good.
So when people talk about like principles of nonviolence, sometimes it's painted as if this, person's like they're principally nonviolent. So they're pacifist in the sense that they never endorse violence as a means. On other occasions, it's like, yeah, they're principally nonviolent, but here's this instrumental reason or practical reason why it's going to change conditions structurally, ideologically, or whatever. Maybe like in the context of, not just marches, but intervening to change economic conditions. Let's say some people are practically, like destruction of property could be justified, right? Violence against bodies, not. So where does Rustin fit in this? I think there's a tendency to just be like nonviolence, and that means cold.
Yeah.
But maybe there's kind of he's probably got a deeper view.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think one scholar broke down, I think, just 15 versions or something of just Christian nonviolence alone.
Mm-hmm.
So, Rustin was a principled pacifist, coming from his Quaker heritage, so he got that. But he also saw, shorter version of the story, there's a missionary named E. Stanley Jones who happened to go to Asbury Seminary, where I did my master's. He went to India. He befriended Gandhi. He taught Gandhi about Jesus. And Gandhi was like, hey, I like this Jesus fella and a lot of his nonviolent ideas. Gandhi figures out really good ways to put these in practice. Well, then that comes sort of full circle in that those ideas that came through Jesus, through E. Stanley Jones to Gandhi, and not to say Gandhi had also drawn plenty from his own Hindu tradition, but kind of putting all this together, and then it comes back to Rustin. And so Rustin kind of puts together the principled part from his Quaker upbringing, that it's just, he had a belief in he would say the brotherhood of man, right? That all people are family, they're siblings, and so doing harm to somebody is always unacceptable, immoral. But he also recognized that there was a pragmatic value in this too, that it had a great deal of capacity to bring about social change. So this is a good example. A lot of folks don't know this, but at the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott, King and a number of his associates had applied for concealed carry permits, and King had armed guards. And so when they call Rustin down, Rustin and King meet in King's kitchen. He already knew Coretta. That's another story. But they sat down in the kitchen, and Rustin sees a gun leaning, like a shotgun or a rifle, leaning over against the wall, and basically chews King out and says, you're either in on this nonviolence thing or you're not. And for Rustin, it was like, it might have pragmatic value, but it has to be principled first. And for him, it had to be a life, like a whole life, was nonviolent. So trying not to harm someone with your words, these kinds of things were very important to Rustin. On destruction of property, that's a topic I'm fascinated in because I've argued before that I don't think destruction of property is violence, well, inherently. Rustin doesn't ever seem that I know of to make a case, but we do hear through King's words when he says, riots are the language of the unheard. And I think that was kind of Rustin's position too, was I don't think that we should be harming people or destroying property, but that's where we're headed. And this is where he and Malcolm X played off each other so well, and they both understood their role, because Rustin was basically like, hey, let's try the nonviolent approach of King, because if we don't do that, then you get Malcolm X's version of this, and it doesn't look as pretty, right? So for him, he was principled, again, with the kind of one weird exception near the end of his life that I'm still trying to parse out of my mind, where he argued that Israel ought to be the one nation on earth that could claim to have a right claim to be armed, a rightful claim to be armed. And my reading of that at this point is what I said earlier. His main kind of friends growing up were Jewish. And then the second part of that was that during World War II, Rustin was a conscience objector, but not only of like kind of the normal kind of conscience objector, but he also refused to take any of the offers that the government had given to conscience objectors where they could serve in various nonviolent roles and these kinds of things. So he ended up spending 3 years in prison, which while he was there, he integrated the prison. Fun fact. Yeah, I'm sure other people were involved too, but he headed a movement to that. And so when he came out of prison, it was right about the time that the news was starting to report the atrocities of concentration camps and stuff in Austria and Germany and Poland. And so I think that all that came together where Rustin was kind of like, these people just keep getting screwed. I don't know what else to do. Like, I'm at a loss. Let them have some missiles. Is kind of why I feel like, because I feel like today, if he were, and this is a whole other topic, I think he would be speaking out against Israel's current actions. But just a weird thing at the end of his life, like I said, he seemed to let that principle go for that one that one exception. That only, as far as I know, that's it. I mean, even at the very end of his life, he was still making a case for nonviolence and participating in nonviolent protest. One other thing that this may interest y'all, kind of along the lines of that, he had one of his most famous, perhaps his most famous essay is called From Protest to Politics. I think the subtitle is The Changing Faces of the Black Freedom Struggle, something to that effect. And in it, he argues that the time for protest has basically ended because that protest had brought about certain civil rights gains. And so now folks have right to work and right to vote, and these things are being protected more. So he argues in this essay that they should move away from a protest model to a partisan politics model where they really emphasize registering folks to vote, getting folks to voting places, making sure they can vote safely, all of these kinds of things. But a scholar named Terrence Wiley put out an essay a few years ago. He's a Black anarchist scholar arguing that Rustin got it wrong. And I also think that at the very least, one doesn't need to replace the other, that the protest piece of it can't end. And I think it was foolish for Rustin to try to make that argument when the protest element of his work had such a clear impact on American society. The fact that he would sort of say, okay, it's time to put the protest thing down, I think was really a mistake. And after the March on Washington, when he argues for this, we see a lot less of Rustin in kind of the national movement and national movements in general, because he kind of backs off from some of this. And like I said, some folks argue that he turned pretty hard right. I don't buy that fully, but something definitely changed, where he wasn't quite the outspoken activist and protester that he was for most of his life, kind of after the March on Washington and the Freedom Budget for All Americans, which came a few years after that.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
We appreciate the discussion today. And next week, for our discussion, we have the Muslim Student Association is going to be sharing experiences and talking about Ramadan, which actually starts next week. So please come for that. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank y'all. I enjoyed it. If anybody wants to talk at all, I'm here. And also this stack of books on the table is some books about Rustin that may or may not interest y'all.